Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. What a good thing the Cardinals don't have a home game today. It's a beautiful day. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm delighted we have a quartet of authors this afternoon, which is really fun. Two of them, Margaret and Paula. We're going to talk to them because there's a new subgenre that seems to be coming along called the canine. K-9. It took me a while to figure that one out. I couldn't believe how dumb I was when I finally realized why it was called K-9. Anyway, there are several books that are now featuring dogs as part of the sleuthing team, sort of like Holmes and Watson, but with a canine. So we're going to talk about that. But right now, Hank Ehrlich, who is new to me, is setting a series in North Georgia. And over here is Scott Graham, whose National Park Mysteries I think are absolutely wonderful because they're so much fun to explore. And the new one is set up in the Arches area up in Round Canyonlands, right? Where I have been, and which
That's
I
right.
think is gorgeous. But when you started, I'm trying to remember, you've done Grand Canyon, you've done Yosemite.
Yes, Yellowstone and Rocky Mountain.
That's it. So what
This is
inspires
number
you to do, how do you pick the park?
Well, we started with, I've been working with my publisher on this, kind of developing the series. And what we did was started with the four kind of the big, well-known Western national parks to see if we could get the series to launch that way.
You were trading on the park name, not your name.
Absolutely, because I didn't have a name to trade on yet. And so we started with the Grand Canyon because it's one that I grew up near the Grand Canyon in Durango, Colorado, and have spent a lot of time in the Grand Canyon. So it started with basically what I knew, writing what I knew, and worked kind of north from there to Rocky Mountain National Park, another park that I knew very well, into Yellowstone and Yosemite, and now we're coming back kind of closer to my home and closer to the area that I really know and love, which is the Arches and, as you say, Canyonlands area of southeastern Utah with the new one.
Up around Moab. And for any of you who haven't driven, I think you drop down from Interstate 70. There's just over the border into Utah, there's a road that goes down through the Colorado Thruway, which is one of the most beautiful roads that I know of. And eventually it gets to Moab. But so you could do it reverse, right? You could go to Moab and then drive up that way. And you can stay there. There are some ranches in there. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I'm giving you a hint.
Area. That's right.
For another road.
For the next one, yeah. Well,
or you could do Escalante.
There you go.
Or Zion.
That's right.
Or Bryce.
Right.
Right,
Yeah,
yeah.
it has to be alliterative though. So we've got Mesa Verde Victim coming out next year, and Canyonlands Carnage is the one I'm working on now for 2021. So we are staying in that area, in the Four Corners.
So do you feel when you're going along here that you're following in the footsteps of Nevada Bar?
Absolutely, with great humble reality of what she does, and it's so beautiful what she does. And her, the difference that I always talk to people about is that she has the ranger who moves from park to park. I have an archaeologist who moves from park to park. And her character, arguably her character is more character driven, or her series. And mine really try to emphasize the park and give a sense of place to people who want to learn about the park. And give some sense of the park, and then I've got a family who are moving from park to park with the father of the family doing archaeology. So not as kind of that specific personal character driven that Nevada Bar has done, but absolutely trading on the thing that she's done.
Right. Well, the genius in Nevada was that she took the park ranger culture with her park to park. So it was sort of like the Jessica Fletcher thing, where Cabot's Cove was the culture, which got really overworked, and so. By just taking Nevada and the Rangers to park, she avoided what we call the Cabot Cove syndrome. Now, there's another author, Christine Carbo, who has written several mysteries set just in Glacier National Park. And so she's chosen, a different strategy.
Yeah, and her books, if anyone hasn't seen them yet, are wonderful as well. And they're coming out right now. She's
taking a year off. I can update you because I just talked to her. But nonetheless, for those of you who are National Park junkies, you have at least 3 series that you can read. And National Geographic has just published a book, which we don't have in yet, which is going to be all the national parks. It's one of those gigantic Christmas books, whatever. But anyway, I've ordered it because I think our parks are endangered, and they're such a fabulous American treasure that it's really worth giving them attention. So I'm glad that you do that. Let's switch over to North Georgia. North Georgia is a wonderful landscape, but I'm assuming that you're more character driven. I mean, you're more focused on your people?
Well,
Or maybe not.
Maybe a little bit of both. Definitely setting is hugely important to me. Atmosphere, I would say, my books are very atmosphere driven. A lot of times I've gotten readers and reviewers have said that my stuff's sort of Southern Gothic, and that's definitely something that I enjoy personally. And I kind of came to crime through horror. I used to write horror under my real name, and so there's definitely
Real name?
Yeah.
Well, confess.
My real name's John Mantooth, so you probably haven't heard of me. That's why I have a pseudonym now, because my first book, a horror novel, The Year of the Storm, did not sell really well. So that's.
You know, you were just ahead of your time. It's really interesting. I'm always being asked, what's the next new thing? Because the whole Gone Girl psychological thriller thing is so overdone at this point that everyone's longing for something new. And from a publishing standpoint, it's a very difficult choice to stick with that because there's no series loyalty, there's no name brand loyalty. So you get one hit like Gone Girl, then you can have like 25 that fall into the abyss, right? So anyway, the next big thing, one of them is a revival of the modern Gothic novel. Yeah. So you are just coming into your own.
Yeah,
is that great?
I hope so. It's overdue, but yeah. But to answer your question, yes, I mean setting and atmosphere are hugely important to me. Now, I base my novels on sort of the people and the area of North Georgia. Both of my parents were from North Georgia area, and I spent a lot of time there. I actually grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, so a little different. But I fictionalize the area because that's just easier for me, and it gives me a little bit more freedom. But so far, I haven't had any complaints from readers saying, this wasn't in the right place or anything like that. So, because my settings are very rural, very isolated, sort of actually in the mountains. The towns, down below get introduced some, but a lot of it takes place sort of in the woods. So.
Well, there's actually a long-standing tradition of Gothic in this area. Sharon McCrum certainly wrote some in her ballad novels, and Philip, whose name I can't think of at the moment. Philip. Anyway, he wrote a whole series. Philip do something or other. He wrote a whole series of Gothic set in that area.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Ron Rash. He's one of my favorites, and he's a little bit further north than where I set my stuff. I'm also really influenced by William Gay, who is a Tennessee writer. Sure. And those guys kind of edged into literary a little bit, and that's kind of where I see my stuff. Even though it's a series, it's maybe not traditional. There may not be as plot driven as some mystery series. They're a lot more atmospheric. There's hints of the supernatural in there, I guess, from my horror background.
What about David Joy? Are you familiar with?
Yeah, I'm familiar with David Joy. Yeah, he's probably a little more literary than where my stuff fits, but yeah, that's same aesthetic probably.
Philip Dupuy. This is the thing about old age, right? Everybody thinks that your memory fails, right? It's not that your memory fails. I just proved it to you. What it is the retrieval machinery. It's so overclogged that it takes it longer. You can hear it going blur, blur, blur. Because if I'd forgotten it, I couldn't come back with it, right? I comfort myself with this. But nevertheless, it's true. So Philip Dupuy, who really wrote, you probably have to find those on ebooks or something but they are really terrific books. There's just something, the whole thing about the mountains, I think partly it's because the Scots came over and settled in. That's the Outlander bookstore, obviously. I know all this, right? But they brought the ballads and that whole kind of Gothic thing with them. Yeah. And then because people lived isolated, like in the case, I used to live in East Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
Never fit, but I was there. Right. Anyway, because of the valleys and the coves and everything were so isolated, you wound up with a very
unique culture.
You did, but it lent itself, I think, very much to the idea of the Gothic.
Oh yeah,
for sure. What fun for you?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it, and this is my third. Just came out last week, and they also have sort of a. Well, I'll just give you a little background on the main character, Earl Marcus. His father was a fundamentalist mountain preacher, and he was also a snake handling preacher. And so
there's the Gothic part there.
Yeah. Right. Earl's kind of formative event in his life was when his father told him to stand in front of the church and hold the snake for the first time. Well, the snake turned right around and bit Earl in the face. And he nearly died, but his father, being the fundamentalist mountain preacher, would not take him to the hospital. He wouldn't call a doctor. He just let him lay there and said, you know, if God wants you to live, he'll let you live. And he lived, but Earl sort of thinks maybe it'd been better if he hadn't, because he's had a pretty tough life, and he's kind of haunted by that past. And he actually moves away from North Georgia for years and years and falls into detective work, and then comes back home. And this is the first book, the first novel, because there's rumors that his father's died, but there's also rumors that his father may still be alive somewhere in the mountains. And that sort of takes the first book follows that story of him finding out what happened to his father. And so after that, he decides to stay in North Georgia and kind of keep at it, working as a private investigator.
So, archaeology, do you have any particular credentials as an archaeologist? Why did you pick one?
Well, I've been what is called an amateur archaeologist, or just someone's been interested in archaeology my entire life. Having grown up in Durango, Colorado, near Mesa Verde National Park, I think all of us in Durango kind of consider ourselves amateur archaeologists. And,
or you could be trained specialists.
There you do. That's the other thing.
Because that's the really good thing to do in Durango, is to ride this rocky, what is it?
Narrow gauge.
Yeah.
Social narrow gauge, and I did work my way through college on that.
Did you?
Cool.
I sure did every summer. Yeah, so
It's a fabulous trip.
So I could do
Up the
some
river
training stuff.
Animas Valley,
Yeah.
and the first hour is sort of okay, but then it becomes completely spectacular as you go towards Silverton. Oh my God.
Exactly.
It's one of the great train trips.
It
Sorry,
really
I
is
digress.
one. No,
There's
that's
also
fine.
an absolutely fabulous bookstore in Durango, Colorado called Maria's, which was saved, I think, by the community recently, wasn't it?
Well, no, actually, I will say Maria's has done. We're very good friends with the owners of Maria's Bookshop, and it is worth giving them a plug because it is a wonderful bookshop, and they've just done a tremendous job of running a wonderful bookstore that has now just been taken over by their son, 22 years old, right out of college. He's starting to take over that store.
But that was a shaky transition there. There
It's-
was a while when it wasn't clear he was going to come back and like run the family farm.
Precisely.
Yep.
He just graduated from college and has come back, and they're taking a year to see how that all goes. So you're right. It could be an interesting transition. We keep joking about it. Looking for the deer in the headlights look of Evan in Evan's eyes. Who's taking over that bookstore. Anyway, again, we're digressing, but it's a wonderful bookshop.
We always digress. That's the entire point of this. Nonetheless, back to archaeology.
Right. So I actually then went and took a college course that the state archaeological department puts on for what are then called avocational archaeologists, who are the volunteers who go out and work on archaeological digs that are necessary if you're going to put in a new highway or a new development. There isn't enough money, enough taxpayer money put aside for archaeologists to be completely hired to do that work. So you bring in volunteers. So you can take a course in that, which I took. So yeah, so that's kind of the through line of these mysteries, is that there's always an archaeological discovery that occurs by my archaeologist protagonist, and then that discovery will kind of drive the plot in terms of what can happen next. And we're talking murder mysteries, not necessarily completely over the top, but they're very over the top type of discoveries that really give you this wonderful, fun flavor of what archaeology is all about. That's what they're meant to do.
So you didn't have to actually write your stories as murder mysteries. Why did you decide to do that? You could have picked, some other like literary fiction or whatever to write about the parks.
Well, I just love the whole murder mystery genre. The idea that you've got this template, and of course, national parks really lend themselves to that idea. Forever, the best-selling book in many national parks, but specifically in Grand Canyon, has been called Death at the Grand Canyon, which essentially just people are fascinated by, and all it is a rewrite of all of the deaths that have occurred, the reports from the deaths that have occurred at the Grand Canyon, divided up by heat stroke and cliff fall and drowning in the river, and that's all it is, just a rewrite
And
of those.
photo ops.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable the amount of people that have died
Back.
for a selfie. It's truly. Can I really digress? This is one of my truly favorite stories. My daughter and I, my third trip to Peru, my third trip to Machu Picchu, and I said to her, I'll take the train up, but I'm done with the park. Been there, done that. I'm going to go back and lounge back down there in the Sacred Valley, and you can spend the night and, hike up the mountain. I'd already hiked up to the gate, the whole bit. So she went off with her guide, and she came back, and when she showed up the next afternoon, she was still kind of like a deer in the headlights. I said, what happened? And she said, well, there are 3 mountains you can climb. If you look at the pictures of Machu Picchu, you can go one way up to the Sun Gate. Then there's Huayna Picchu, the one that, that sticks straight up that everybody wants to climb. But there's actually a 3rd mountain, which is the hardest one. And there was a German guy and his girlfriend, and they were determined to climb that mountain. So they had a guide, and they went up the mountain. And the girl didn't quite make it to the top. She just couldn't do it. So she stopped, and the guy went on with a guide, and he got up to the top, and photo op, leapt up into the air for his photo, fell right off the mountain. Crashed down, died, obviously. It was just horrible.
Right.
And, and there are people at the Grand Canyon who have, climbed over barriers, and then there was a couple of actual murders. Who was the guy that was convicted, remember, for encouraging his wife to step backwards until she fell into the canyon?
Right.
I mean, there's just no common sense.
Right. Well, but that is somewhat the fun of what I'm doing. I mean, to take it, to the fun side of it, which is that there are many ways to get in big trouble in the national parks. And so I have a really good time talking with friends about, for this one we could have this happen. And one of my goals has been to not have a lot of guns in my mysteries, because
thank you. That's
guns in
very
our culture are just so, as we all know. And so it's been really a kind of an interesting and fun challenge to find ways to kill off characters without using guns. And in national parks, I'm telling you, there are a lot of ways.
There are a lot of bears. My friend Dana Stabenow, who's now moved in for her 2-month winter residence, because it's not cold enough in Alaska anymore, it's just yucky, so she'd rather be here, is always talking about death by Alaska. And mostly it's death by bear, because people don't pay any attention, but there we are. So commonly, it's the commonest way to kill people in North Georgia.
Wow. Yeah, snakes will do the job.
He didn't die, so that's quite it, right?
There's been others. Most of my books haven't had a lot of actual murders. Like I said, the first book was him trying to find his father. The second book, he's more of I guess now I think about more of a missing person, because the second book was him trying to find his girlfriend, and in the third book he's trying to uncover some corrupt policies in the area that are traced back to this boys' reform school, sort of isolated reform school in the mountains. Murder's not been a big part of it. So
you're really writing quest novels. That's a different thing, but they are. I love quest novels. All the way back to Le Mortature and the night, Gawain and the Green Knight and the whole bit. Everybody needs a knight.
Yeah,
we need a knight right at this moment. So.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. He's I think of him more as they're about secrets. That's kind of what interests me. What secrets does the landscape hold? What secrets does the community hold? Does the church hold? Almost every book has kind of been about him uncovering secrets in the past, and I guess that's what excites me as a reader. And not to say there's not. I mean, there's definitely. I mean, let me step back, because the last book actually starts with a dead body in his yard. So there's definitely murders, but that becomes almost a secondary to leading him to the real secrets, and then the finding out who murdered the man in his yard is secondary in the end. So.
Yeah, it's really too bad that mystery today always seems to subsume murder, but in fact there are some great mysteries that are not about murder at all. Yeah. You can have jewel thefts, and you can have kidnappings, and you can have Dorothy Sayers wrote an absolutely fabulous short story, which Lord Peter, under disguise, goes to rescue this girl, and it turns out that whoever's holding her is withholding her thyroid, which can lead to a perfectly awful death. So it's a rescue story, but it's not. Nobody actually dies. I think it's really too bad that at the moment everything seems to have a murder in it, because there could be a lot more fun without.
Agreed. Yeah. I would say, we were talking about sort of influences and Southern influences. To me personally, James Lee Burke is sort of my hero and the guy that made me want to move into crime, really. So I'd like to say maybe my stories have a little bit in common with his, being atmospheric and maybe not just always about a murder, but about a bigger issue within the region.
Definitely region. James Lee Burke is the only author I know who could get away with the title in the Electric Mist with the Confederate Dead. Oh Lord, what a great title. What a great book, in point of fact, you know. But no, Jim is truly, you know, one of a kind.
Yes.
But I'm not at all surprised that he would have pulled you in. So good news for you. There is, starting in January, Poison Pen Press is, with the Horror Writers of America, is starting a series called The Haunted Library, which we are bringing back horror classics. So one of them, which everybody thinks they know, is Phantom of the Opera, but actually you don't if you haven't read it. And it comes with discussion questions and annotations and all kinds of things. And the next one just got a starred review today. It's called The Beetle. And the third one is some really bizarre book called Bacek or something. But it's going to bring back a lot of this genre. So it really is on an uptick. So
Yeah, I think so.
don't despair of your other persona. Your time is coming. Right. So thank you guys. Let's talk to Paula and to Margaret, and then we'll do questions and answers for all the authors. Okay? So at the end, when they're all here, I'll get out of the way. You guys can ask questions or whatever you'd like for all four of them, if that will work out. So Margaret, last year you had an injury, and we were so sad that we didn't get to see you.
Thank you very much. Actually, appendectomy.
Was that what it was?
Mhm.
Okay.
And it was 2 years ago. I did make it here last year.
Well, there goes my memory again. All right.
No, that's fine.
But I wasn't
You
here.
weren't able to be here that day, so that's fine.
I was probably somewhere,
Yes.
like in Machu Picchu, right? There it is. That's another artifact of old age. Go while you can.
I was very happy that I wasn't traveling when that emergency appendectomy
I'll bet.
popped up, which most of them are. But as I was coming out from the anesthesia, I was telling the nurse, "Oh, I'm so happy I wasn't on the road when I had the surgery." And he said, "You must have been, because you've told me that 4 times."
Well, something you can incorporate into your books, right?
That's
Wonderful.
right.
So Paula came to see us with her first mystery last year, but Paula is actually a literary agent, which I think is interesting. How is it, you spend your time selling authors to publishers? How is it to suddenly become one? Is it a weird feeling?
Well, it's a lot easier to pitch
Other
clients'
people's?
books than it is to pitch my own. It's more uncomfortable, but I love pitching my clients' books. And Tor is starting a new horror imprint. To speak
They
of.
are too?
They are, but original, new.
I understand.
Yeah,
But see, it is a trend.
yeah,
It's
it's
a real
definitely a
trend.
trend. Because I have a lot of clients who write horror, and they've been writing mostly short stories because there's been a market for that. But now there is a market for book length horror. So yay.
Oh, that's really fascinating. So why did you decide to write a book, Elvis is Your Dog?
This is a dog.
Right. What interested you in pairing up Elvis and your gal?
Well, it was actually, I was writing a book called The Writer's Guide to Beginnings for Writer's Digest, and as an agent I see a lot of beginnings, and as an editor I saw a lot of beginnings, and if the beginning doesn't grab you, that's the end, right, of your
The end of your
choice.
beginning?
No
Right,
beginning is
exactly.
an end.
So I had a lot of fabulous beginnings from famous books and authors that we know and love, but I needed a chapter that I could revise over the course of the book to show how to get this great first chapter. So I just made one up. And I had been at this fundraiser for Mission Canine Rescue, which is this organization that takes defense contractor dogs who've served in the military, who've been abandoned in shelters, and rescues them. And I fell in love with the dogs and the handlers and the soldiers and the bomb-sniffing dogs, and they had, cops and drug-sniffing dogs, and they had game wardens and illegally procured fish-sniffing dogs, you name it, they had it. And I fell in love with all of them. So I just threw everything I loved in this chapter for this beginnings book, and my agent said to me, "You should finish that." And so I did. And I think there's a lesson there for writers. If you throw everything you love into your books, you may have some real juice there.
So you have, this is so good. Remember how lawyers are never supposed to represent themselves and doctors shouldn't operate on themselves and all. So as a literary agent, you have an agent.
I have my own agent, absolutely.
Very good.
Yeah, that's actually how I became an agent. I had been an acquisitions editor before, and Gina Panettiere of Talk Hot Notch, I'd done a lot of deals with her, as an editor, and she represented my nonfiction. And so, yeah, you should never be your own agent. Bad idea.
Margaret, why did you decide
Yes.
to write about Robo and basically a police procedural set in Colorado? I mean, you could have written anything, so why that?
I am married to a veterinarian, and there is a veterinarian protagonist in this book besides Robo and Deputy Matty Cobb. And I always wanted to put a veterinarian into a book. My husband came home from work one day, and he said there are some dogs that he was doing health exams on to transfer to the Forest Service for things like detecting drugs through the Forest Service or illegal wildlife trafficking, that kind of thing. And I thought, I knew I didn't want to write an amateur sleuth with just the vet. And I thought, well, why not have a canine handler and her dog and the vet? And I was inspired by Margaret Cole and J.A. Jance, and they both have two protagonists in their books. Well, so I decided, okay, let's just go ahead and have two protagonists, and there'll be a love interest between those two.
And the dog. As a bonding thing.
And the dog is, yes, he's definitely a third protagonist.
So I remember back in the 90s when there was a movement called Woman Sleuth, which involved Sue Grafton and Kinsey Milhone, and Marcia Muller was writing about Sharon McCone and Sarah Peresky, V.I. Warshawski and all, and there was an author called Jan Burke, who somehow I realized today, coming down here, is not writing, so I'm going to have to send her a stern email. But I remember that she was writing about a sleuth called Irene, and then one day she wrote a book about a cadaver dog, which really got everybody's attention because nobody had actually used a cadaver dog as a character, you know, in a mystery. And a cadaver dog, if you're going to write about dead bodies, is incredibly useful.
Yes.
The book Bones.
I think that was it, yeah.
Yeah, I read that book. It's an excellent book.
Yeah, Jan's a great writer.
Loved it.
She is, but I'm trying to remember whether there were many dogs as characters and as sleuths before then. I mean, Jim Rollins wrote a couple of books, because he is a veterinarian that involved a military dog, I think.
Right.
But
And then-
there haven't been a lot up until all of a sudden.
There are the Robert Crace books that came out right before my books came out. But he and I were actually taking some of the same classes in Colorado at writing conferences where we had canine handlers come and demonstrate for us. And of course he was already established and didn't need to find an agent and publishing house. So I believe his books came out maybe the year before mine did. But he has two excellent books with canine handler,
They're not almost called.
Suspect and The Promise.
You're right. I forgot about those.
Yeah, I just wrote an article for Book Page in which I mentioned Paula's book,
Oh, well, thank
but
you.
I mentioned seven different authors that
Who
are
are the
doing
rest?
canine. Well, I'll try to remember. Alex Cava,
Oh, that's
right.
Alex has
Cava.
them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Spencer Quinn.
Yeah.
Now that's a totally different thing
Yes.
than what Paula and I write.
Oh, yeah.
Very different.
Very different.
Bernie is, is
Chet and Bernie.
Chet and Bernie, right? And you know they're set here in Phoenix.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Mhm. That's cool. So they're fun. And then Barbara Nicholas, she lives in Colorado Springs.
Right.
So
And David Rosenthal.
Yeah.
The whole
Mhm.
the Andy Carpenters, which
Mhm.
are absolutely wonderful. He's been here for umpteen times, and
Mhm.
we always do a dog on the golden. Where's Joe? Joe, where are you? There. Joe has helped us do that. There's a golden two, actually, aren't there, Joe? Golden Rescue Societies here.
Yeah.
And they've come in and we've raised all kinds of money for them because you can bid on characters. You know, if you successfully put in a bid, then David writes your name into a character in his next novel. You don't necessarily get to choose whether you're the hitman or the victim or whatever, but it's a great fundraising thing. So David is one.
Right. He has a golden
I
rescue in Maine now.
Yes, well, he moved.
Yeah, he
His
moved.
book called Dog Tripping, where
It's
they took the
hilarious.
books across the country. I mean, the dogs at a caravan across the country is amazing. All right.
And I think that kind of rounds it out, because I did mention Robert Crace
You
in the
did.
article.
But there were just the 2 books with the dog?
Yes.
Because they
the
were
dog.
Elvis Cole books, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you're in good company. It's a trend. See, there we are. All right.
I think it is a real trend, yes. Mhm.
All right. So what makes Robo, who Robo is? Robo being the dog.
Robo's a German Shepherd. He was inspired by a real dog, and the person who was his handler became a friend of mine. She actually started out being a friend of my mother's, and she worked in Bellingham, Washington. They were both injured in a warehouse explosion, and Robo was deafened. And the friend went ahead, and she became pretty ill from the chemicals and the toxic things that she inhaled. So she ended up moving back to Colorado kind of to heal and get well, and that's when I had a chance to meet her. Robo had been retired when he was deafened, but he became her pet. So it ended well in that he ended up dying of old age, not that injury. And I met her after he had died. So she had just told me story after story after story, which has really helped with the books. And we went ahead and got to know each other more and more. She consults with me. But I think what makes Robo who he is, he's kind of structured after being a wonder dog. And the real Robo actually was. He would compete at a lot of these canine trials. It sounds like similar to where you kind of got started, Paula. But he would often be the top dog. He would often win. So I decided that's what I wanted, was just a wonder dog. I mean, we loved Lassie back in the day, and Rin Tin Tin. And so that's how Robo became who he is.
A hero, right. So is that how Elvis came around?
Well, I had met a lot of Belgian Malinois military working dogs through Mission Canine Rescue. And I grew up in a military family, had a soft spot in my heart for that world. And so I had Mercy, who was an MP in Afghanistan, and she's engaged to a dog handler, and Elvis is his dog. And there's a battle in which she is wounded, and her fiancé is killed. And the last thing he says to her is, "Take care of my dog," because he knows that Elvis is a defense contractor dog and could face an uncertain future. So she has to come home, find him, he's abandoned in one of these shelters, and bring him home. And they've both lost their man and their mission, and so they have to find a new way forward.
And so you two have introduced a male love interest, right?
Yes, yes.
Can you not do that and have a successful story? I mean,
Well, I love game wardens too, and we had just adopted this Newfoundland Retriever mix named Bear, and so I gave. There's a Vermont game warden named Troy Warner, and his search and rescue dog Susie Bear, based after Bear, and so it's a nice contrast, because the Belgian Malinois Elvis is this sort of fierce, handsome, strong, smart dog, who's not, he's a one-woman dog, right? And then there's Susie Bear, who's friendly and loves everyone, and so they're nice contrasts, right? She does the search and rescue work, and then the dogs work together, and they have to learn to work together, just like Mercy and Troy do. So.
right. And in your second book, there's a real history behind of an autistic child that went missing in Vermont in the woods.
Right. We think of hikers and hunters getting lost in the woods all the time, right? But the people most likely to get lost in the woods are elderly people with dementia and children with autism. It happens all the time, and it happened in Vermont. A little boy went missing, and he was rescued, safe and sound, yay, by search and rescue, canine and humans, first responders. So I thought, right, being a mystery writer, what if a little boy with autism got lost in the woods during hunting season and witnessed a murder? Then, Mercy would have to find him, and Elvis would have to find him, and they'd have to find a way to communicate with him so they could understand what exactly he saw, and then keep him safe until they apprehended the murderer.
Yeah, it's a very compelling story, and I didn't realize till the end. I didn't read all the extra stuff until the end that it was based on a real story, but that made it even scarier. I'm now remembering there was a really interesting woman who wrote a series about bloodhounds. Did you run across her? She died. She was elderly when she started, and she only wrote a few, but she was really terrific about bloodhounds and how bloodhounds work, which is different than the two dogs that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Was her first name Sue?
I think I read those years ago, right?
Sue Henry.
No,
No,
she
it
was the
wasn't
one that
Sue
wrote
Henry.
about the Huskies, and she wrote about the Iditarod, murder on the Iditarod. See, another dog book.
And
now,
I haven't read the lady you're talking about,
I'll
but
try to
I
remember. I'll sit here and remember while you're all talking. Right.
I have heard of the Bloodhound books, though.
But they
I
were
haven't read
fascinating
them.
because she was really very good about how bloodhounds actually work, and
Right.
it looks magical to the rest of us, right?
Yeah.
But there's a real science to it and training
Absolutely.
to it and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about your current story. We know Paula's now is the
Oh.
child of the woods.
Tracking game starts with the premise of wildlife trafficking. And so that's kind of how I got that seed or kernel idea to write about. But I think these stories are real character driven. And so beyond the murder mystery are the characters, and of course the two characters who are falling in love, Cole and Maddie. So I decided to build in a theme of love, which is sometimes a little hard to do in a murder mystery. And so there are all kinds of things going on in this book that demonstrate love: brotherly love, mature love, romantic love, parental love, love of the land, love of animals. All of those scenes are put together to kind of help Maddie find her way in this new relationship with Cole. And so even some of the motives for the murders are based on love. So I hope those people who are reading it really enjoy it. I really enjoyed writing it. And there's a creature feature in part of it, where Cole and Maddie are having to track down an animal that Maddie has heard growling in the forest, and that's also linked to the murder of the victims. And so, that part is pretty suspenseful, where they're hunting down this particular animal in order to save it. They're not wanting to kill it because it doesn't belong in Colorado, and it's an animal that's actually been brought into Colorado to be hunted. So.
Which is a horrible thing. So Maddie is weighed down in her relationship by her own past history. And
That's
the
right.
same is true over here for you, because Mercy has this really sad history of having lost her fiance and her mission, as you say.
Right.
So, do you do that to make the characters more interesting, more alive? I mean, because you don't have to give them backstories like that. You could do something else.
No, but I think, we all have griefs in our lives, right? And I think certainly soldiers have witnessed grief and experienced grief, and military families have experienced it. So I thought that was really realistic. They don't necessarily talk about it like my dad, was in Vietnam and in the Cold War and did all kinds of stuff he still won't talk about. But, there is a wound there, I think, even though it goes unspoken. And that it appeals to me.
One of the reasons I asked is that every series starts at some arbitrary point of time. You pick the character and you give them a situation and you give them a backstory and so forth. And in my experience, almost all long series end up with a prequel, because at some point, you want to go back to before that point in time, and by then we know a lot about the characters and we're more curious. Michael Connelly wrote 4 books, and then I still remember he wrote The Poet as his 5th book with a completely different character. And then I remember him sitting down with me and saying, Bosch is a cop, and he's had 4 stories that were all personal to him, the last one being investigating the murder of his mother, like the Black Dahlia. And he said, so he needs to have a case that's just because he's a cop. He's out on patrol and, body in the trunk's called trunk music or something. And I thought that, that that's true. That's one way to go. But increasingly, I'm seeing that long series. People are going back and writing. In fact, Charles Finch will be here in February. Is writing a trilogy prequel.
Oh, wow.
He wrote one, and then that didn't have enough space, so he's now writing a trilogy that is all a prequel. And it's really interesting to read them if you've read, the series going forward, because the woman he eventually marries is married to somebody else in the prequel, and you think, So, I don't know that you will necessarily.
Is that in the works? Is that in the works? Is that your question? I'm sorry, I was anticipating your question.
I was probably just making a decoration,
Oh, okay.
but no, it wasn't
That's
a question that you were going to write a prequel. But the question, I guess, really would be, why did you pick that particular framework to start with? Because you could have done something different.
I did pick the framework of Maddie becoming a newly minted canine handler, so that was kind of why I decided to start there. They're fresh out of the academy where she learns how to handle the dogs. And as far as talking about the prequel, what I've been doing is just slowly unpacking her baggage as we go through the series. And I've written book 6 this past summer, and I hope to give the reader quite a bit about Maddie's backstory in book 6, so we'll advance that. It would be probably the closest thing to a prequel that I will.
Well, I'm not espousing prequels. I'm just saying I think it's really interesting. If you.
I think it's interesting too.
Right, Larry King once said to me that writing a first book is like packing a trunk. You put stuff in it that you might never need, but if you didn't put it in the trunk, you can't pull it out later. And I thought that was an interesting way, to look at it also, that you have to drop things.
Absolutely. When I got this contract for the series, I thought, okay, and I went back and read all my favorite his and her point of view mystery series. So Julia Spencer Fleming and Ellie Griffiths and whoever I could think of that wrote similar stories, and Louise Penny too, although it's not his and hers. But I read them all from the beginning to see, how many clues were in that first novel. It's amazing how your subconscious works. All that stuff you put in the first novel and then how they work it in later, right, for the subsequent books. It's really fascinating.
I think it is too, and the character that you first write about evolves, and so the character at book 5 maybe, part of the point of reading the books is to follow these characters and see how they develop, and where it gets boring is if they stay the same, which is Michael's point. You can't just go on doing that. You have to do something to really. I have to do an interview. KJS has asked us, some of our staff, to do mystery reviews. And so I have to do one tomorrow down at the studio, and that's what I'm going to talk about, is how to keep a series interesting. And Michael's going to be one, and then our own Donna's Casey, who's done something really different, is going to be the other one that I'm going to talk about. But, how is it that you readers want to stay reading an author in a series for a long time? Why would you get bored, or you don't? I remember when Dana killed off, her Kate's boyfriend, people abandoned the series. They were so pissed. But she's never going to kill the dog. There's another person with a dog. And many authors have sat here and said, they could kill off like every other person in the book except the protagonist, but they can't kill a dog or a cat or, any kind of domestic pet would be fatal.
Disaster.
Yeah. And I find that so interesting that we're all willing to cast people, into the abyss, but not the dog or the cat. So, anything else you'd like to say? You're working on a 3rd book?
I'm working on book 3 now, yes, and it's interesting because it's a cold case. Her grandfather, Mercy's grandfather, was a sheriff up in northern Vermont, and it's a cold case that has, again, secrets, and a lot of her backstory will come out, the backstory of her family. And yeah, so that's fun.
Great. And Margaret, we already know that you're working on a book because you told us. So let me say goodbye at this moment to our video audience, and I'm going to ask Scott, and where is he? To the pseudonymous author, to come on up and take the microphone, and then you all can ask questions, whatever you might like to do.